I was just thinking about how we always talk about, smooth travels and wishing people safe flights, but lately the news has been anything but smooth when it comes to aviation.
Hmm.
And you've clearly noticed this too, sending in this whole stack of articles about some pretty unsettling incidents. It seems like the end of 2024 has thrown some serious turbulence our way.
Yeah, it's certainly been a cluster of events that's hard to ignore.
Exactly. We've got the Air Canada flight in Halifax with that dramatic landing, the tragic crash in South Korea, and then the Azerbaijan Airlines plane being shot down over Kazakhstan.
Right.
It's a lot to process and honestly makes you wonder, are we seeing some kind of shift in aviation safety?
Well, statistically speaking, flying is still incredibly safe.
Okay, good.
But these incidents do raise some important questions about specific vulnerabilities and whether there are any emerging patterns we need to be aware of.
Okay, that's reassuring to hear about the statistics. But I'm still really curious to dig into those vulnerabilities you mentioned. Let's start with Halifax. Everyone survived, which is a huge relief. But seeing those images of that plane with the broken landing gear, sparks flying as the wing scrapes the runway, it's hard not to feel a little shaken.
You're right. It is the visually dramatic incident that plays into those common anxieties people have about flying.
Yeah.
And while a broken landing gear might sound like a relatively minor malfunction, it can actually have catastrophic consequences. In fact, there have been several high-profile crashes over the years directly attributed to landing gear failures.
Wow, I didn't realize landing gear was such a critical point of failure.
Mhm.
So this Halifax incident, even though it had a good outcome, could be a sign of something more systemic.
Possibly. We need to look at whether this is part of a larger trend. Are we seeing an increase in landing gear incidents across the board?
Hmm.
Is there a specific type of landing gear that's proving to be problematic?
Right.
These are the questions investigators will be exploring.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like one incident might be a fluke, but when you start seeing a pattern, that's when the alarm bells should go off.
Precisely. And it's not just about identifying the problem, it's about understanding the root cause.
Right.
Is it a design flaw, manufacturing defect, maintenance issue?
Hmm.
The answers to those questions will inform the solutions.
So what can we as passengers do with this information? I mean, should we be asking about the landing gear on our next flight?
Well, it's certainly reasonable to be aware of these issues, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend grilling your flight attendants about the landing gear.
Okay.
The more impactful action you can take is to stay informed about aviation safety news and support organizations like the Flight Safety Foundation that are working to improve these systems.
Okay, good advice. Now let's shift gears to the South Korea crash, which is obviously a far more tragic situation with a much higher loss of life. What makes this incident particularly concerning?
What's unusual and unsettling about the South Korea crash is the way the plane came down. It landed at high speed without deploying its flaps or landing gear.
Right.
This wasn't just a rough landing. Something went catastrophically wrong long before the plane touched down.
The sources I sent mentioned the possibility of cascading failures. Can you explain what that means in this context?
Imagine a chain reaction where one problem triggers another and then another, ultimately leading to a complete systems breakdown. In the case of the South Korean flight, there's speculation that bird strikes may have been the initial trigger, potentially causing dual engine failures.
Okay, I've heard about bird strikes before, but I always assumed planes were designed to withstand them.
They are to a certain extent. Modern aircraft engines are rigorously tested to withstand bird strikes.
Hmm.
But multiple strikes, especially if they involve large birds or impact critical components, can overwhelm those safeguards.
Hmm.
And it's not just about the engines themselves, it's about the potential knock-on effects.
So if the bird strikes damage the engines, what else could have gone wrong?
Well, if the engines are severely damaged, you could lose electrical power, hydraulic pressure, or both. This could impact everything from the flight control systems to the landing gear deployment mechanism.
Oh, wow.
Suddenly you're dealing with a domino effect of failures, and the pilots are faced with an incredibly difficult and complex situation.
That sounds absolutely terrifying. And the runway was long enough for a safe landing, right?
That's what makes this crash even more perplexing. The runway was over 9,000 feet long, which is more than sufficient for most landings, even under emergency conditions.
Right.
So the fact that the plane came down at high speed without flaps or landing gear suggests a total loss of control in those final moments.
It's like those pilots were fighting a losing battle from the moment those bird strikes occurred.
It's certainly a scenario that raises questions about pilot training and whether they are adequately prepared to handle these kinds of cascading failures.
And there was that strange detail about the plane's data transmissions stopping at 900 feet. What could that indicate?
The loss of data transmission adds another layer of complexity to the investigation. It could point to a catastrophic electrical failure, damage to the transmission systems, or even some unforeseen interference. Determining the cause of that data loss is crucial for piecing together the final moments of the flight.
It's like a black box within the black box. We have this flight data recorder, but then we have this mysterious gap in the data right before the crash.
And that gap could hold the key to understanding what ultimately led to this tragic outcome.
All right, so we've got the Halifax incident potentially hinting at wider landing gear issues, and then this incredibly complex and unsettling crash in South Korea. It's definitely painting a more nuanced picture of aviation safety than just planes are safe, statistically speaking.
And that's precisely why we're having this conversation. It's about understanding the nuances, the complexities, and the potential vulnerabilities of this system that we rely on so heavily.
But before we get too bogged down in the technical details, let's take a step back and acknowledge the human cost of these incidents. Over 250 lives were lost in aviation accidents just in December alone. That's a staggering number.
It is a stark reminder that these aren't just abstract events or data points. They represent real people with families, friends, and dreams.
Right.
And we owe it to them, to everyone who steps onto a plane, to strive for the highest levels of safety.
Well said. Now, the third incident, you mentioned the Azerbaijan Airlines plane being shot down over Kazakhstan. That's a whole different category of aviation risk, isn't it?
It is. It shifts the focus from mechanical failures and pilot error to the very real and increasingly complex dangers posed by geopolitical conflicts.
Right, and the sources I sent you paint a pretty murky picture of what actually happened. We have Putin apologizing but not taking responsibility, and then these reports of electronic warfare systems potentially being involved. It's a lot to unpack.
It certainly is. And it highlights the challenges of ensuring aviation safety in a world where technology is rapidly advancing and geopolitical tensions are on the rise.
Okay, so let's dive into that. First, can you explain what electronic warfare systems are and how they could pose a threat to civilian aircraft?
Electronic warfare systems are essentially designed to disrupt or disable enemy communications and radar systems. Think of them as tools for electronic jamming, creating false targets, and essentially blinding the enemy's electronic eyes and ears.
So, if they're targeting military equipment, how could they possibly affect a civilian airliner?
That's the concerning part. There's the possibility of misidentification, where a civilian aircraft is mistaken for a military target.
Oh.
And then there's the potential for unintentional interference, where these systems, even when used responsibly, can disrupt civilian aircraft navigation and communication systems.
So it's like even if you're not flying directly over a war zone, you could still be at risk if these systems are being used in the vicinity.
Exactly. And that's a new level of complexity that we're only just beginning to grapple with in terms of aviation safety. We're moving beyond traditional threats like mechanical failures and pilot error into this realm of electronic warfare, where the risks are less visible but potentially just as devastating.
And what can be done about it? How do we protect civilian aircraft from these invisible electronic threats?
Well, there are several approaches being explored. One is to develop technologies that can detect and mitigate the effects of electronic warfare systems on civilian aircraft. Imagine a kind of electronic shield that could filter out disruptive signals and protect critical navigation and communication systems.
That sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie. But is it actually feasible?
It's certainly an area of active research and development.
Okay.
And there are promising advancements being made in signal processing and interference cancellation technologies.
That's encouraging to hear. But technology alone can't solve everything, right?
Absolutely not. We also need clear protocols and communication channels between military and civilian authorities to prevent misidentification and minimize the risk of unintentional interference. It's about striking a delicate balance between national security interests and the safety of civilian air travel.
Okay, so we've got a potential technological solution and the need for better communication and coordination. It's a complex issue, and it feels like we're just scratching the surface here.
We are. But the first step towards finding solutions is recognizing the problem and understanding its complexities.
Well, I think we've definitely achieved that in this deep dive so far. We've gone from a general sense of unease about recent aviation incidents to a much deeper understanding of the potential vulnerabilities and emerging threats facing the industry.
And hopefully that understanding will empower you, our listener, to become a more informed traveler and a more engaged citizen when it comes to aviation safety.
That's a great point. We've covered a lot of ground, from landing gear failures to cascading failures to the looming threat of electronic warfare. It's a lot to process, but hopefully it's also empowering. Because the more we know, the more we can do to advocate for safer skies for everyone.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, and in this case, it could be the key to preventing future tragedies.
And on that note, I think it's time to shift gears a bit and talk about what you can do as an individual to make a difference.
Before we were discussing the incident involving the Azerbaijan Airlines plane and the potential role of electronic warfare systems,
Right.
this situation brings up a range of anxieties for those of us who fly regularly.
It definitely does. It's like we're used to thinking about things like, mechanical issues or pilot error, but this idea of invisible electronic threats is a whole new level of worry.
I understand the concern. It's a relatively new and rapidly evolving threat,
Hmm.
and there's still a lot we don't know about the potential impact on civilian aviation.
The sources you sent me mentioned that electronic warfare systems can disrupt or disable communications and radar systems.
Right.
But can you give us a more concrete example of what that might look like in a real-world scenario? Like,
Yeah.
what would a pilot actually experience if their plane was being targeted by one of these systems?
Imagine you're a pilot flying over a region where electronic warfare systems are active. Suddenly, your instruments start behaving erratically.
Oh.
Your navigation system might show incorrect data, your communication systems could go haywire, and your radar might be flooded with false targets or completely blanked out.
So it's like sensory overload, but for the plane's electronics.
Exactly.
Oh.
And in that situation, the pilot is essentially flying blind, relying on their training and judgment to make sense of the chaos and maintain control of the aircraft.
That sounds incredibly dangerous. And it makes you wonder, how do pilots even train for something like that?
It's a real challenge, and it's something that flight training programs are only just starting to address. Traditional simulators are good at replicating things like engine failures or bad weather,
Right.
but they haven't been as effective at simulating the unpredictable and often subtle effects of electronic warfare.
So are we basically playing catch up in terms of training and technology?
To a certain extent, yes. The development and deployment of electronic warfare systems has outpaced our ability to fully understand and mitigate their potential impact on civilian aircraft.
Hmm.
But the good news is that there's a growing awareness of this issue, and there's a lot of research and development going into finding solutions.
That's good to hear. But in the meantime, it feels like we're flying into uncharted territory, both literally and figuratively.
I understand the sentiment. It's a new reality we're facing, and it demands a new level of vigilance and awareness from all stakeholders, from the airlines to the regulators to the passengers themselves.
Speaking of passengers, you mentioned earlier that there are things we can do to be more informed and proactive. But what can we realistically do when we're talking about something as complex and invisible as electronic warfare?
Well, first and foremost, stay informed. Follow reputable sources of information on aviation safety and stay updated on the latest developments in electronic warfare technology and its potential impact on civilian aviation.
So knowledge is our first line of defense.
Exactly. The more you understand about the risks and the potential mitigation strategies, the better equipped you'll be to make informed decisions about your travel plans and to advocate for stronger safety measures.
Okay, so stay informed. What else?
Don't be afraid to ask questions. If you're concerned about the potential risks of electronic warfare on a particular route or with a specific airline, reach out to them and inquire about their safety protocols and procedures for dealing with such threats.
That's a good point. Sometimes just asking the question can prompt airlines to be more transparent and proactive about addressing these concerns.
Precisely. And finally, remember that you have a voice. Contact your elected officials and express your concerns about the potential risks of electronic warfare to civilian aviation. Encourage them to support policies that prioritize research development and international cooperation on this critical issue.
It's like that old saying, if you see something, say something. But in this case, it's more like, if you understand something, speak up about it.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Public awareness and engagement are crucial for driving progress in any area of safety, and aviation is no exception.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground on the topic of electronic warfare. It's a complex and concerning issue, but I feel like we've at least shed some light on the potential risks and the steps being taken to mitigate them. Now let's circle back to something we touched on earlier, cascading failures. This idea of one problem triggering a chain reaction of failures is pretty terrifying, especially when you think about what might have happened on that South Korean flight.
It is a sobering concept, and it's one that's not limited to aviation. Cascading failures can happen in any complex system, from power grids to financial markets. It's all about understanding how seemingly isolated events can interact and amplify each other, leading to a catastrophic outcome.
You mentioned earlier that bird strikes might have been the initial trigger in the South Korea crash, but how could something as seemingly innocuous as a bird strike lead to such a devastating chain of events?
Well, it all comes down to the concept of redundancy and the potential for those redundancies to be overwhelmed. Modern aircraft are designed with multiple layers of safety systems and backup components precisely to prevent a single point of failure from causing a catastrophic event. But in the case of the South Korean flight, there's a theory that the bird strikes might have caused damage that went beyond the engines themselves, potentially affecting multiple redundant systems.
So it's like if you knock out enough of the backup systems, even a relatively minor problem can escalate into a major disaster.
Exactly. Imagine a scenario where the bird strikes damage the engines, leading to a loss of electrical power. Without electrical power, you might lose hydraulic pressure, which could impact the flight control systems, the landing gear, and a whole host of other critical functions. Suddenly, the pilots are dealing with a cascade of failures, and the margin for error shrinks dramatically.
It's like a domino effect, but instead of dominoes, it's entire systems failing one after another. And there's nothing the pilots can do to stop it.
In some cases, yes, the cascade of failures can be so rapid and overwhelming that there's very little time or opportunity for the pilots to react effectively.
Yeah.
But that's why we have rigorous training programs and sophisticated simulators to try to prepare pilots for these incredibly challenging scenarios.
So it's about giving them the tools and the mental models to make the best possible decisions under extreme pressure.
Exactly. And it's not just about reacting to the failures as they happen. It's about anticipating potential failure points and taking preventative measures to avoid the cascade in the first place.
That makes sense. But how do you anticipate something as unpredictable as a bird strike?
You can't predict every eventuality, of course, but you can study past incidents, analyze data, and identify patterns that might indicate a higher risk of cascading failures. For example, are there certain types of aircraft that are more susceptible to this kind of chain reaction? Are there specific maintenance procedures that might reduce the risk?
Right.
These are the questions that safety investigators and researchers are constantly exploring.
So it's about learning from the past and using that knowledge to improve the safety of future flights.
Precisely.
Uh,
Every incident, whether it's a minor malfunction or a major tragedy, provides valuable data that can be used to refine our understanding of these complex systems and develop strategies to prevent similar events from happening again.
That brings up another point we discussed earlier, the role of data in aviation safety. We talked about the missing data in the South Korea crash, and you mentioned the potential of real-time data streaming as a way to improve data collection and analysis. Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Absolutely. Traditional flight data recorders or black boxes are incredibly valuable tools for accident investigation. But they have limitations. They only capture a snapshot of the flight data, and they can be damaged or lost in a crash. Real-time data streaming, on the other hand, would allow us to continuously monitor critical flight parameters throughout the flight, providing a much richer and more complete data set for analysis.
So instead of waiting for the black box to be recovered after a crash, we'd have a live feed of information coming from the plane.
Exactly. And that live feed could be used not only for accident investigation, but also for real-time monitoring and anomaly detection. Imagine a system that could analyze the incoming data stream and flag potential issues before they escalate into major problems.
That sounds incredibly powerful, but I imagine there are challenges to implementing something like that, right?
They're both technical and logistical. We need to ensure the reliability and security of the data transmission, manage the massive volume of data being generated, and address privacy concerns about the collection and use of personal information.
Right, it's a delicate balancing act between safety and privacy.
It is, but I believe the potential benefits of real-time data streaming for aviation safety are significant enough to warrant further exploration and investment.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of technical ground here, but let's bring it back to the human element for a moment. You've talked about pilot training, but what about the role of air traffic control and the ground crews who maintain these aircraft? Are they equipped to handle these increasingly complex challenges?
That's a crucial point. Aviation safety is a team effort, and it requires everyone involved, from the pilots to the air traffic controllers to the maintenance crews, to be constantly learning and adapting to the evolving threat landscape.
So it's not just about individual skills and expertise, it's about communication coordination and a shared commitment to safety.
Absolutely. And that's where organizations like the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, play a vital role in setting global standards, facilitating information sharing, and promoting cooperation among nations to enhance aviation safety worldwide.
It sounds like we need a global approach to address these global challenges.
We absolutely do. Aviation transcends national borders, and safety in the skies requires international collaboration and a shared commitment to excellence.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive. We've explored the complexities of cascading failures, the potential of real-time data streaming, and the importance of international cooperation in addressing the evolving challenges of aviation safety. And through all of this, we've seen how the human element remains a critical factor, both as a source of potential error and as the key to finding solutions.
Exactly. Technology can provide us with incredible tools and insights, but it's ultimately human ingenuity, expertise, and collaboration that will drive progress in aviation safety.
And that brings us back to you, our listener. You might be thinking, okay, this is all very interesting, but what can I actually do with this information? And that's precisely what we'll be discussing in our final segment. We've spent this deep dive unpacking some pretty heavy stuff, near misses, tragic crashes, and visible electronic threats.
Hmm.
It's a lot to absorb, and it's easy to feel like aviation safety is this massive, complex system that's totally out of our control as individuals.
I understand that feeling, but it's important to remember that even small actions can have a ripple effect. Your choices as a traveler, your voice as a citizen, these things do matter in the bigger picture of aviation safety.
Okay, so let's break that down. Practically speaking, what can our listener do to make a difference?
Well, let's start with something everyone does, choosing an airline. We often get caught up in price and convenience, but safety records should be a key factor in that decision. Organizations like the Flight Safety Foundation publish detailed reports and rankings based on a range of criteria.
That's something I've been guilty of overlooking myself. I
Oh.
usually just go for the cheapest flight or the most convenient schedule.
Yeah,
But you're right, it's like, why wouldn't we factor in safety when it's literally a life or death matter?
exactly. And these reports aren't just about crashes. They look at things like maintenance practices, pilot training programs, and even how transparent an airline is about safety incidents. A little research can go a long way in making more informed choices.
So we're not just passively accepting whatever flight pops up first on the travel website.
Right.
We're actively seeking out information about the airlines we're considering.
Precisely. And don't be afraid to go a step further and contact the airline directly with any questions or concerns you might have.
Hmm.
Ask about their specific protocols for dealing with potential threats like electronic warfare, or how they train pilots to handle cascading failures.
I think sometimes people hesitate to ask those questions because they don't want to seem like they're overreacting or being a nuisance.
I understand that, but airlines should welcome these questions.
Hmm.
It shows that passengers are engaged in taking safety seriously. And frankly, if an airline is dismissive or evasive when you ask about their safety practices, that's a red flag in itself.
That's a really good point. It's like they should be proud to share what they're doing to prioritize safety.
Absolutely. And beyond choosing airlines carefully, there's the broader issue of advocating for systemic change.
Right. So how do we move from individual actions to making a difference at a larger scale?
One of the most effective things you can do is contact your elected officials. Let them know that aviation safety is a priority for you, and encourage them to support policies that strengthen safety regulations. Fund research and development for new technologies, and promote international cooperation on these issues.
Sometimes it feels like our individual voices get lost in the noise, but you're saying that these individual actions can actually add up to something meaningful.
They absolutely can. Politicians pay attention to what their constituents care about. And when enough people raise their voices about an issue, it can drive real change.
So it's about making aviation safety part of the political conversation.
Exactly. And there are other ways to get involved. Support organizations like the Flight Safety Foundation that are dedicated to research, advocacy, and education in the field of aviation safety.
These organizations are on the front lines, pushing for improvements and holding the industry accountable.
They are. And finally, don't underestimate the power of staying informed and sharing your knowledge with others. Follow reputable sources of information, engage in online discussions, and spread awareness about the complexities and challenges of aviation safety.
It's like we talked about earlier, knowledge is power. And in this case, it's the power to make more informed decisions, advocate for change, and contribute to a safer flying experience for everyone.
Exactly. Aviation safety is an ongoing journey, and it requires the collective effort of everyone involved. From the engineers who design the planes, to the pilots who fly them, to the passengers who choose to fly, we all have a role to play.
So to our listener out there, we hope this deep dive has not only informed you, but also empowered you. You've learned about the intricacies of aviation safety, the potential vulnerabilities, and the emerging threats. But more importantly, you've discovered that you're not just a passive passenger, You're an active participant in this complex system.
And your actions, no matter how small they may seem, can contribute to a safer and more resilient aviation industry for everyone.
We encourage you to continue exploring these issues, asking questions, and making your voice heard, because at the end of the day, aviation safety is not just about statistics and regulations, it's about people. It's about ensuring that everyone who steps onto a plane can do so with confidence and peace of mind.
That's a goal worth striving for. And by working together, by staying informed, and by demanding better, we can make it a reality.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Fly safe and keep those questions coming.